Thank you so much for showing up in such large numbers. It's great to see you all in the room. It's actually fully booked out, which is excellent. So welcome, everyone. My name is Rob Raven. For those who don't know me, I'm the Director of Research at Monash Sustainable Development Institute. And before I do anything else, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we gathered today, and pay my respect to the elders past and present. So very pleased to see so many people here today, including in this room and also online. And I'm really here to briefly open up the program today, and introduce the speakers. But before I do so, I want to spend a few words on the MSDI Affiliates Program, which is this event is a part of. So we established this program in 2023, last year, and this is really to help Monash and help us all to deliver on large-scale programmatic research with impact. And this is something we cannot do individually. We have to collaborate in order to do so. And we cannot stay in our individual research silos or in our university silos. We need to collaborate in interdisciplinary ways and in transdisciplinary ways. And this is what this program tries to achieve. So we run a series of events. We're very much open also to bottom-up initiatives. So if you have ideas, please do come to us with your ideas, so we can help to make those happen. Also important for this program is that it's not just targeting academic staff. We deliberately opened the program also for professional staff and PhD students, because we really want to create this culture also within our university that as researchers, we're not the only ones who have valuable knowledge. People in practice, people in operations, and students, they all bring valuable knowledge and experiences to this challenge of sustainable development. So this is the second event we organized. We had the first event last year, which was a general introduction into systems change with Professor Dirk Lobach as the speaker. Can I just see a raise of hands who is new today, who wasn't at the event last year? There you go. So that's a large amount of new people, which is great. This is excellent. This is a signal of a growing program. We have about 200 affiliates at the moment across all campuses of Monash and across all faculties. And we're planning to extend that. So if you have colleagues who you think should be part of these conversations, please join. It's free and it's an easy process. So today we'll talk about the circular economy as a topic of our focus. There are many reasons to do this. Obviously, circular economy is a really important concept in policy and practice at the moment. Started out in Europe, particularly years ago, and now in Australia since many years, about 5 years. We also now are thinking about what a circular economy could look like in the Australian context and how that can help us achieve sustainable development. It's also one of our, in MSDI, it's one of our key domains that we focus our research and impact and education on. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Mike Ryan to come here and provide some words of introduction. Many of you will know Mike, of course, as our interim Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research. Mike has a Bachelor of Science and PhD in biochemistry and also runs his own laboratory. But I don't think you will talk about that today, Mike. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Rob. And I also would like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land we're gathered here today, pay my respects to elders past and present, and also extend that acknowledgement to any Indigenous colleagues here joining us today. Again, welcome here to the Chancellery. Welcome everyone to this MSDI Affiliates Program. Really a fantastic initiative, Rob and team for developing this and also for this particular topic as well. And as Rob mentioned, it's almost 200 individuals of the affiliates. Hopefully it'll be 201 if my application will be accepted. So today's theme is towards the circular economy. It's really asking a lot of important questions, and I really hope that we'll have many of these questions addressed today by our speakers and our panelists as well. For example, how, as we as an institution, with all that we can do, all our capabilities, our excellence in research, our education, our operations, our fantastic operations and infrastructure, our international campuses as well, how can we do that along with all of those networks that we've got to accelerate the transition to a circular economy, both what we do here at Monash, and we have a framework around that, but also much more broadly as well. And I think this will be really great. But also, how can we improve the interface between what we do as researchers and how we implement policy as well, so in a business context. So I'd just like to, as a biochemist and somebody who works in a more traditional sense, but obviously engaged with foundations and other bodies, and having a really now greater overview of what we do as an institution broadly, and faculties and institutes, and really phenomenal amount of research we do and impacts we make. I'd sort of really talk around the role of the university and role of MSCI and the role that we do in fostering excellence. And we're really able to actually foster so much great research because we've got clarity in our purpose. We've got clarity in understanding that we're here for the public good. Our legislated foundational purpose is that Monash University will realise social and technological transformation to meet the challenges of the age for the aspiring communities and the industries around us. And us broadly is, we are a global institution, very proudly global. And so us is global as well. And as part of our Impact 2030 strategy, one of our core objectives is to support and to celebrate all forms of research. That's true from discovery research to translational to impact-orientated research at scale for the betterment of people and planet. And that's a really important thing, and something really we want to continue to do and look at how we implement that and support that and celebrate it. But we know that great research, whether it's at the discovery level or whether it's at the impact level, it's a team sport. People often working together, people working across disciplines, people are working across institutions in partnerships, geographies and timescales. So it's a really big, challenging area, and it's so important that we get this right. And one of the ways we are fostering this at Monash, it's through our mission-oriented research approach. It's crowding in the partners, crowding in the people, crowding in the organisations together, committed to that research mission in order to create an expanded agenda, something that will address our global challenges, the ones that we've mentioned in Impact 2030 of climate change, geopolitical security and thriving communities. And that's really what we do with our strategic approaches around collaboration, communication, harnessing the collective good of the institution, our education, our professional staff, our community partners, all of those underpinned by what we do with our rigour and our excellence in research is where we can help actually affect change. And we've got great examples already in this mission-orientated research. The World Mosquito Program comes to mind, but also great areas in MSDI, including RISE, Climate Work Centre, and the Chitteram River Project, for example, as well. And these approaches, they're great examples of building these partnerships, and the partnerships are really critical, and how we implement that is going to be really important. Partnerships with government, business, philanthropy, our communities, and our communities are going to be so important to us, and how we engage with those as well. So this is another big question, is how we actually build this together to create those effective partnerships. Who do we create them with in order to reach the research goals, including meeting the goals of the circular economy? So, look, I hope this session will be really insightful. I think it's a great topic to discuss as a group here at Monash University. Thank you all for coming. And I think one of these really wonderful things about bringing different people together from different faculties, different portfolios and institutes is a way that we can actually get to meet each other and talk to each other, communicate, and develop those partnerships that are really so critical for actually driving success and impact as well. So please take advantage of that. I saw that obviously lots of people were eating and having discussions outside, but continue that along as you go on. And again, thanks Rob and the MSDI team for creating this really important event. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mark, for those really great words and great references also to missions. And we will talk a little bit about in our interactive session in the second part of this afternoon about what that mission might actually look like at an organization as ourselves. So I would like to move on and introduce our keynote speaker of today, Julian Kirchherr. Julian is an associate professor at Roskilde University in Denmark and has a PhD in geography and environment from the University of Oxford. And he traveled all the way from Germany here, which we are very thankful for. We try to make the most of his visit. We already had a seminar yesterday and we go to Canberra tomorrow. So just to say, he's not flying in just for this event today. So he's highly cited. Julian's highly cited for his research on the circular economy. So he also has, I should say, positions at Cambridge University in the UK, at Utrecht University. Well, he's written great papers. He is one of the most highly cited papers in the circular economy. Highly cited authors in the circular economy. Great paper on definitions, the plurality of definitions that exist in the literature and in our policy discourse, and some of the challenges around that. And another great paper on analyzing policy lessons through a policy framework. What can we learn from Europe in terms of the policy frameworks that have been established there? If that doesn't sound enough, that's basically just a side gig for Julian. That's only one day of work at the university. He also works 4 days as a partner at McKinsey. I don't know, and you have a child of 3 years old. I don't know where you get the time from. Maybe you get by with 2 hours of sleep or something, but it's amazing how productive you are and how much impact you do your work. So without further ado, Julian, I would like to give the floor to yours, and thank you again for speaking to us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rob, and thank you so much, everyone. Excited to be here in Australia. And the 2 hours of sleep for sure have been true for the last couple of days. I've had a pretty bad jet lag. I must say, probably the worst jet lag I've had so far. First time ever in Australia with these 10 hours of time difference. My body feels it. Very excited to be here and to talk about the circular economy, specifically 3 items of the circular economy. Number one, what is the circular economy? Rob just referenced some of my works that looked into this. Second, I'll talk about circular startups. That has been a research stream within the circular economy literature for me for 7 years now. And in a sense, you could say the circular startups are my bet. And I think they're all of our best bet when it comes to transitioning to the circular economy. And then lastly, I'll talk about what I call circular disruption. And that is essentially, what is it that's needed from policymakers, from academics, from venture capitalists, in order to make sure that we have many, many more of those circular startups, and that ideally these circular startups become circular scale-ups, and maybe some of them, they knock out those linear incumbent companies out there. So that's the program for the next 40 minutes. And I'd suggest let's jump right in. And let's jump right in also with the first key message, which is there is an incredible buzz in the academic literature these days when it comes to the circular economy. I think it's a buzz, at least in my professional life, 15 years or so, I have not seen. There's been a lot of buzzwords when it comes to sustainable development over the last couple of years. Biomimicry, industrial ecology, sustainability transitions, it's also an important field. But if you look at the articles published in the last couple of years in Scopus Index journals, you'll see that there's no topic that has seen so much growth, and that is now also seeing so many articles per year as the circular economy. Overall, we have something like almost 40,000 academic articles now on this topic, so a huge body of knowledge that has developed over the past couple of years. Now, I started researching the circular economy back in 2017, actually January 1st, 2017, when I was hired as a tenure-track assistant professor at the University of Utrecht. Rob was sitting in the room right next to me, and I had been hired at Utrecht University under one condition. And the condition was that I was supposed to launch a second research field. My first research field actually had looked into anti-dam movements in northern Myanmar. So it's a bit of a niche research field, and I struggled somewhat to convince the university to hire me with this very niche, very small research field for a tenure-track position. Utrecht was kind enough to hire me, but they said, Julian, the Netherlands, it's a very flat country, so you need to stop researching these dams, or at least research them a lot less, launch a second research topic. And I looked around a bit, and Prior to my PhD, I'd already worked at McKinsey. I'd done 1 or 2 projects on circular economy, and I got a list of possible topics I could research from my second research stream from the back then dean at the Copernicus Institute. And the one topic that jumped at me was circular economy. So I said, well, I've done 2 projects on this at McKinsey. I'm basically an expert. Let me jump into this. And the first couple of weeks at Utrecht, I then really delved into the literature, as you do when you start researching a new topic. And I read dozens and dozens of papers around the circular economy. And the more papers I read on the circular economy, the more confused I got, because I felt that when I read 3 papers, there was at least 5, at times also 7 different understandings of what the circular economy actually meant. And I couldn't find a single paper that actually discussed that. There seemed to be a lot of papers on the single term, whereas everyone seemed to mean something differently. And then I said, okay, the first paper I'll write about the circular economy to get into the literature is actually a paper that looks at all of these definitions. And that paper you find here on the left of the slide, it's called Conceptualizing the Circular Economy, an analysis of 114 definitions, where indeed my co-authors and I looked at 140 definitions of the circular economy, compared them systematically. And because that was so much fun back in 2017, I've repeated the exercise last year and actually looked at 221 definitions on the circular economy that have been published ever since I published this paper on the left. Now, I briefly considered talking the entire 40 minutes about the nuances of these 221 definitions. Martin, Geisdorfer, and Rob suggested to do otherwise. So I'll just very briefly cover what came out of this work to make sure we all have a common understanding and common ground when it comes to the circular economy. Now, when my co-authors and I looked into all of these definitions, both in 2017 and also in 2023, we essentially saw 3 big buckets appearing in all of these definitions. One is around the core principles of the circular economy: reduce, reuse, recycle. Some definitions put 10 R's, some have 8 R's, some have 7 R's, but almost every definition will have some kind of R's in this in their definition. Second, we found in most definitions also some discussion around the aims, right, of the circular economy, with a lot of authors saying it's actually there to serve sustainable development. It's not just a means, it's not just an end in itself, but it's a means to an end. And last but not least, there's also a lot of definitions that touch upon enablers. What do you need to bring the circular economy about? And I just brought one slide to showcase a bit also the debate that's going on here in the circular economy, which is a slide that let's jump into the 4th row here.
Julian, I think your sound's gone, so you might have to change to that one.
Test. Yeah, it's better now. Fantastic. Let's jump into the 4th row, social equity. You see, actually, not so much has changed here in the past couple of years, and only 1 out of 5 definitions back then, slightly more today, actually look into this topic of social equity. In my opinion, still a huge research gap when it comes to circular economy, thinking about what are also the social impacts. And at the very end of this talk, minute 39, I'll also showcase some research about the social impacts of the circular economy. And last but not least, something a lot of scholars don't talk about, and I still think that remains a big research gap, is actually the future generations, right? Circular economy, what does it mean for future generations? In the original set of definitions we looked at, just a single definition mentioned it. Today, it's around 10% of definitions, but I still think it's something where it's worthwhile spending more time on. Now, you probably wonder, what is it that you learn when looking at 221 definitions of the circular economy? And obviously my co-authors and we couldn't stop ourselves after reading 221 definitions of the circular economy to then propose the 222nd definition of the circular economy. And you see it here. And I'll quickly read it out as a bit of a foundation of this talk. What's the circular economy? If you look at all of these definitions, it's a regenerative economic system which necessitates a paradigm shift to replace end-of-life concepts with reducing, alternatively reusing, recycling, and recovering materials throughout the supply chain with the aim to promote value maintenance and sustainable development, creating environmental quality, economic development, and social equity to the benefit of current and future generations. It is enabled by an alliance of stakeholders, industry, consumers, policymakers, and of course also academia and their technological innovations and capabilities. Very long definition, somewhat clumsy definition. It's not meant as the one and only definitions, but it's basically an attempt as a meta definition to capture the different core themes that we saw when looking into all of these different definitions. And I think indeed what's most important to keep in mind are these three pillars that I mentioned previously, the core principles that are there, the aims that are there, and the enablers that are there. Now, Rob Raven mentioned that my core job is actually not being a university professor, associate professor, but that I actually spend most of my time in the private sector in consulting. And sometimes my friends in consulting, but also my clients, they look into what am I doing on this 1 day per week, typically my Friday, where I spend my nose deep in academic articles. And then many of them has also seen that I do this work around definitions. And let's be honest, I've been teased more than once how I can be so obsessed about definitions. And I was asked more than once also, isn't this the kind of ivory tower academic work that Julian, actually that's not very much of use also to practitioners. Now, I very much disagree with that, and this slide tries to capture why, because I very much think that if you're serious about bringing the circular economy about, it's actually important that as a very first step you all agree on what it means, right? Otherwise cumulative knowledge development on this topic is very, very tricky. And I think we in particular saw prior to 2017 that there was a lot of writing about the circular economy, but it was on so many different aspects. There was so much disagreement that there was basically a lot of activity and not so much movement, right? And our paper, in a sense, tried to change that a bit. I think we're not completely there, but for sure, everyone by now in the literature is aware that it's always important to first think about what does the circular economy mean before then actually writing about it. So much on one of my favorite topics when it comes to the circular economy, which is definitions of the circular economy. Let's jump into even more practical terrain, which is circular startups. Circular startups was something I started looking into just a couple of months back in 2017, after I also looked into circular economy definitions. And this was very much driven by, in fact, actually first looking into a lot of incumbent companies that claimed that they were transitioning to the circular economy. Incumbent companies such as Adidas, you probably have heard about it, they have 100% recyclable shoe line. Incumbent companies such as Philips, that have said they don't sell light bulbs any longer, but they allow you to rent light. And all of these companies, incumbent companies, they made these large claims regarding transitioning to the circular economy. But once you double-clicked on these claims, you quickly realized that this was actually just a tiny part of their entire business, and that for some reason, these companies also did not seem to move much farther in their circular economy transition. Some people say maybe an example of greenwashing. I rather like to say it's an example of pilotitis, a disease that's very prevalent in many large companies, which is the disease that you have a pilot, such as the one shoe that's 100% recyclable, but you don't manage to scale this pilot. Now, there was a lot of scholars that tried to figure out how to cure this pilotitis. But I actually back then said, well, why focus also on these incumbent companies that so many research already look into? Why not actually look into a different set of companies that has not been researched so much? And that was those were the startups, circular startups, which my very first PhD student back then and I started to research. I had a couple of friends that had launched what they called a circular startup back then. That's basically how I got the idea to look into this. And what my PhD student and I did back then is we built essentially the very first database of circular startups out there in Europe. Back then, 750 circular startups in the Randstad area in the Netherlands, in London, and in Berlin. And it's a database we've extended ever since, and we actually have more than 3,000 circular startups now across Europe. According to this database, we probably also missed quite a few. And yeah, yesterday I encouraged Martin Geisdorfer to maybe also build a similar database here for Australia, and be very keen to see what are the businesses, circular startups that you have here. Now, this database basically gave initial insights into what are the types of companies that are founded basically on 100% circularity principles. And you see these types of companies, the 5 types we identified on the very right of the slide: design-based, waste-based, platform-based, service-based, and nature-based startups. And let me maybe just pick 2 or 3 to illustrate a bit of the breadth of the different companies that we actually see in Europe that are completely dedicated to making the circular economy reality. I think one very traditional example, and I think there's also many of these examples here in Australia, is the type of waste-based startups. Refill is a good example here. They basically take fully recycled, they basically take car dashboards and old PET bottles, and then they develop fully recycled 3D printing filaments out of this, right? So very traditional waste-based company that tries to create new value out of waste. I think a bit more of a innovative take is maybe Homey, an example of a service-based circular startup, which basically says, why own a washing machine? If you own a washing machine, 90% of the time, this asset will actually be unused. Why not actually just rent it, right? Rent a washing machine and basically do a pay-per-use scheme to make sure that the utilization of this asset massively goes up. Actually, a startup founded also by a professor, Nancy Bocken. Some of you familiar with the literature may know her. And a third example of a circular startup is Excess Materials Exchange. An example of a platform that basically tries to facilitate trade of waste materials, but also offers tracking of these materials. So basically offers a history for all of these products at the same time. These just as some examples of circular startups. Now, if you look at where do circular startups stand in comparison to conventional startups, there's a few, I'd say, concerning messages emerging. And the first and main concerning message is that most of these startups are actually at an even earlier stage than the conventional startups. I mean, somewhat by definition, every startup obviously is at an early stage. But if you look at basically the funding that's being received by the circular startups, we see up until today that yes, some of them have been able to gather some funding, but overall they struggle much more than the conventional startups. And this is something that has been concerning my colleagues and me researching this for a very long time. However, very recently, probably 1.5, 2 years ago, this began to change, and we actually encountered the very first circular startups in Europe that have been able to scale, so to go from circular startup to circular scale up. And we define scaling of a circular startup as being able to raise at least $10 million in venture capital funding, an amount that really allows you to professionalize much, much more than before, that allows you to also accelerate everything you do to a great extent. And we've a couple of examples now of these circular scale-ups in Europe, overall around 15 that are quite exciting and that actually have now such a market traction that many of them are actually known by 1 out of 5, sometimes 1 out of 4 relevant customers in their customer group. One example is Grover. It's actually based in Berlin, also the city where I live in, and it runs a subscription model for electronics. So my phone here is an iPhone. It's not a Fairphone, some of you may know, but it's an iPhone from Grover. So it's something that I actually don't own, but something that I've just subscribed to from Grover. And I can basically pay every month a small fee. I can exchange it for a newer version when I want. And when I give it back, it gets refurbished, it gets fixed, and it gets basically rented out to another consumer. So the idea here is to, again, extend the lifetime again of a product. A great example, and Grover raised 71 million in venture capital funding in mid-2021. A second example, actually one of my favorite examples, of circular scale-ups is the company Twig. And what Twig tries to do, or tried to do, I'll come to that in a second, is it tries to solve that it's oftentimes so cumbersome to sell products that you have used already and that you don't want any longer. I think we all have these products lying around somewhere, but because it's so cumbersome, this kind of like market of used products has never really kicked off. So Twig said, okay, we want to make it as easy as possible to actually sell reused products. And they started this both for electronics, but also for textiles. And I'll give the example of textiles to illustrate. So I have a 3-year-old son. His name is Casper. And as with all 3-year-old sons, he grows very fast. So basically the clothes that he had 7 months ago, they're not clothes he can wear any longer. And sometimes also he doesn't want to wear them any longer because he also starts to develop very strong preferences when it comes to clothes. Now, we have a lot of these clothes now, and in the beginning, I considered basically selling them on eBay, but it's always very cumbersome, right? You get 60 people that write you, and then you don't really know how to price it, etc., etc. Now, what Twig does is basically you can just take a picture of a piece of cloth, such as a pants, and then Twig has an AI built in that will tell you what's the value of this item. So it could be 14 Australian dollars. And then you can push either accept or you can push decline. And if you push accept, the next second, Twig will put 14 Australian dollars on your bank account. And the next morning, somebody from UPS will come and will pick up these pants. So it really makes selling the used product extremely easy. And it's basically a market making that grows this market that has always been there, but because it's so cumbersome, it's never really been activated. So for me, one of my favorite examples of a circular scale-up. Now, there's some sad news though. Despite Twig raising $35 million in Series A last year, 2 years ago actually, they've just gone out of business. Pretty sad. Even my first PhD student, who was their head of sustainable and development and sustainability, couldn't stop them from going out of business. So they've just gone out of business. They actually had quite a bit of market traction. However, the venture capitalists that funded them felt they didn't have enough market traction. It's a tough business once you go in the world of venture capital. So they just went out of business. The co-founders now try to relaunch the company in the United States. Let's see if it's possible. But yeah, I think it's one illustration that even if you have great ideas, that even if you have market traction, it's a long journey to actually become not only a circular scale-up, but become a viable company in the long term. Which is also meant as my bridge to the third part of this presentation, which is basically under the heading of, well, what can we do to stop companies such as Twig from going bankrupt? What's actually needed to make sure that there's what I call circular disruption. Circular disruption is a term some colleagues of mine and I framed to condense what we think is research that should be done a lot more when it comes to research on the circular economy. Essentially, it's the idea that there's a need for a shift, a much more rapid shift than what we see today, from the linear to the circular economy. And circular disruption tries to explain, tries to outline what's necessary to make this shift happen, or in much more practical terms, what's necessary to make sure that companies such as Twig actually don't go out of business, but continue to flourish. Now, if you read the paper, and I put the source in the, I put the link in the bottom of this slide. It's a very social sciencey paper, very theoretical, but I put out one chart that I think is actually very practical and that nicely illustrates the 7 elements that we basically describe of needing to be in place in order for the circular disruption to happen. And I go through all of them, and I then brought a few double clicks, deep dives to illustrate and to go a bit deeper. First, when looking at almost 1,000 companies, we saw that typically those companies that really embraced what we call business experimentation, they tended to be on average, more successful. So business exploitation essentially meaning that they are not too wedded to their initial idea of what a great circular startup could look like, but that they were very willing to, in the startup lingo, you would say, to pivot, right? So to basically, when they see there's not enough market traction with idea 1, to quickly go to idea 2, and if necessary, also go to idea 3, idea 4, idea 5, experiment until they find something where there's actually consumer traction. That was something in our work what appeared as a core success factor. Second, guidance of the search. And this is again a bit of social science, sustainability transitions lingo in here. What's essentially behind this is policy interventions, where we also saw, when looking across Europe, that those countries that were much more aggressive in interventions from a policy perspective towards circular economy were also the countries that had, on average, much more successful circular startups. And I'll give a bunch of examples of how these interventions will look like in a minute. Third, knowledge development. And here's something that we saw as quite essential was also knowledge development and skill development, specifically for the circular economy. Knowledge diffusion, I think that's quite evident. Market formation and deformation, for us, very closely linked also to the guidance of the search, because obviously the public sector can play a large role in creating these markets. And the number 6, resource mobilization. In the trick example, that was, I think, the most evident fundamental issue they encountered at the very end, that they weren't able to mobilize the resources in order to survive. And then last but not least, we call it here social political mobilization, but essentially to me, that's not just the Fridays for Future, but it's also the cultural element of actually having a significant amount of consumers out there that are truly interested in picking up and buying circular products. So this a bit as the overarching analytical framework, and I'll jump into a few elements now. The first element is this element of knowledge development, or I would frame it in different terms as skills for the circular economy. And what you see here is the effort of some of my co-authors and myself of writing down what are actually the skills you need in a circular startup in order for the circular startup to be successful. And in order to create this page, my colleagues and I, we went on LinkedIn. I assume all of you also will have a LinkedIn profile, and we downloaded the profiles of more than 4,000 people working in circular startups that we considered, based on funding, based on data we found on market traction, that we considered successful. And then we aggregated these profiles together with via a machine learning algorithm into what we call a skill taxonomy. And the result is basically what you see on this page, roughly 40 skills that, according to our research, are essential for a circular startup to be successful in their business. And there had been very little research on this topic before, some research very qualitative that basically just did 10, 12 interviews to come up with the first cut. And let me maybe point out 3 things that are very different in our skill taxonomy here based on the, as compared to the previous research. Number 1, actually the core finding or the core discrepancy of our skill taxonomy when compared to others out there is that something like 70 to 80% of our skills are actually skills that are also skills you would encounter in a linear company, right? So skills such as research, skills such as out-of-the-box thinking. And I actually think this is a very good message, because it also means the kind of like journey you have to take as a company in order to get to a circular startup is not so vast overall, because a lot of the skills are always the kind of like same skills. You may say, well, sounds like common sense, but again, if you look into literature and look at the frameworks previously proposed, there's basically 100% of skills proposed that were exclusively circular. Now, I think the second thing that's different here to the previous work being put out is actually this bucket of digital skills, also something the literature didn't mention before, but I can tell you that we didn't find a single successful circular startup that didn't have a significant amount of people actually with basic digital skills. And I think that makes, again, intuitively sense if you think about how businesses work these days, right? I mean, every company will have some kind of digital marketing, every company will have some kind of tech backbone. So I think it's also something to think about. But last but not least, I think the one bucket that are really the the most specific skills to the circular economy is this bucket of system skills, skills such as systems thinking, ecosystem building, value chain collaboration, where we also saw that those circular startups that seemed to be particularly successful had a lot of people that at least claimed that they had also these skills, right? So this is a bit on the element of like, what's the knowledge, what are the skills you likely want to have in your company if you want to go on this transition to a circular economy. Let me jump from skills to guidance of the search, market formation, market deformation in the framework, in very simple terms, policy. And that's also something I've done a lot of work on in recent years. I've also done a lot of work on it because there's been a lot of work on it in practice. We've seen actually 71 countries develop circular economy roadmaps since 2016. 27 of these roadmaps are still at the level of call to action. 30 are real roadmaps and 18 are already operational strategies. So there's really a lot of movement right now when it comes to the circular economy. Now, what my colleagues and I did is we went through all of these roadmaps. It was a bit of a gruesome task, and we basically wrote down what are all of the different policy instruments that are in these roadmaps. And we found more than 400 policy instruments that we then put into this framework that you see here. And we then elaborated upon which of these are particularly common actually in the policy roadmaps itself, but also what are the ones that see a lot of academic research, right? And you see that some elements here in blue both appear a lot in the roadmaps, but also in policy research. For instance, everything that's related to what we call CE competitiveness, right? So modulation of taxes. You just have like 0% tax on something that's a reused good, for instance, as a core example here, or green public procurement, circular procurement, where basically you say the public sector may purchase a product even if it's more expensive than the product, if it can prove that it's circular. So this is something we see both a lot of research, but also a lot of policy instruments in. We also saw a lot of activity in the category 6 here, leakage, which is everything related to waste treatments, emission trading schemes, but also in general, end-of-life management. What we did not see a lot of research or policy instruments on, and I think this is actually something where I'd love to see much more activity, are all of the red and orange categories. Right? And let me just pick out two that are a bit my, I'd say, personal favorites. I think the first one is design, where now we see some activity in some countries in Europe, but where I think there's still a lot more movement possible, and where it's actually from a policymaking perspective extremely easy to implement this, right? So we now see some policymakers in Europe, for instance, discussing that let's take an example of the yogurt bin. Why not make a regulation of saying it needs to be 100% recycled content, right? And the moment you do this, you just create a huge market for recycled plastics, which I think is a great example of a design-related policy instrument. Again, something where there's very little research and where policymakers have been not hesitant, but there's relatively few policymakers implementing this. I think a second category where we still see relatively little activity is the category 3 here, production, where basically there's some, very few researchers, but also very few policymakers specifically looking into how is actually the product being produced, right? Can be a car in Germany, an automotive supplier. So what are really kind of like the standards here? Is the production line set up in a way that there's really low energy consumption, for instance? Is it set up in a way that any waste that's being generated is also reused? That's also something where we saw relatively little activity. So overall, I'd say lots of activity when it comes to policies for a circular economy, lots of announcements. But at the same time, I'd say even in those policy roadmaps that are now actionable, probably still a lot to do, despite more than 400 policy instruments being live all across Europe and the Western world. Yeah, this as a second deep dive example of our analytical framework around circular disruption. And let me jump into a third deep dive here, which is actually the bottom row, if you still remember this slide around circular disruption, the bottom row of political and social mobilization. And what you see here on this page is basically the synthesis of a piece of research I actually carried out with Deloitte, not McKinsey, because back then I was purely at Utrecht University, where we looked into barriers to the circular economy in the European Union. And we ran what was back then the largest survey on this topic in the European Union. We also did something like 50, 60 interviews to really figure out what is it that stops companies to transition at a much accelerated pace towards the circular economy. And a lot of the literature back then had basically said, well, the reason why we don't see so much progress is that the technology is just not there yet, right? So we just don't know yet how to build a certain product in a way that it really minimizes material usage, that it can be easily repaired. It's all technological problems. Now, we looked across sectors. We looked across all countries in Europe. And basically, the core outcome of our research was that it's not the technological barriers stopping the circular economy, but it's what we called the cultural barriers. And the number one cultural barrier we found in our research was actually lacking consumer acceptance, which basically means that if you, as a circular startup, if you put out a product that is the same price as the linear product, that has the same utility as the linear product, the average consumer in the European Union will tend to still buy the linear product. And the very reason for that is that most consumers are just very much routine animals. They always buy the same products each and every year. Just think about, I don't know, the toothpaste, for instance, that probably you've been sticking with for the last 10, 15 years. And even when there's an equivalent sustainable alternative, most consumers don't bother to change. In Europe, there's a category of really environmental aware consumers. It's around 10 to 15% that will switch, that at times will also switch, even if the product that's sustainable is a bit more expensive, but 10 to 15% is plainly speaking just not enough. And it's also not enough for all of these circular startups I showcased to really reach the scale they would need to basically reach a tipping point in the system. So that was the research we actually did in 2018. Lacking consumer awareness, there's been a lot of research coming out on this topic ever since, and at least my read of this research would be that sadly enough, this problem of lacking consumer acceptance, it's not fundamentally changed. My sense is actually even that in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen this group of environmentally aware consumers shrink a bit. Not sure how much the debate is also similar here in Australia, but at least in Europe, we have, I'd say, even a bit of a ESG backlash and to some extent also a circular economy backlash. So I think things have gotten more tricky rather than less tricky in the past 2 to 3 years. Now, so much on some examples of what's needed, right, to get to the circular economy. I showcased some of the skills that should be in a circular startup. I showcased some ideas around policy and what's the policy framework needed. And then last but not least, I just also jumped off this topic of consumer acceptance. I want to touch on 2 more papers before I go into my recommendations for the literature. 2 more papers that I've recently published that I think nicely connect to what I've just outlined. The first one is around circular futures. And let's assume that we're actually implementing all of the different levers I've just outlined, and we actually get to a circular future. I think here, the one thing I want you to take away is that there's actually, it's very unclear up until today, how would the circular future look like? And there's possibly a lot of different circular futures. And if you're a policymaker, it always makes sense to think through which circular future you actually want to end up in. In this paper, Circular Futures, what will they look like? We outlined and described different versions of circular future: circular modernism, state plan circularity, peer-to-peer circularity, bottom-up sufficiency, which are all different in terms of scale. Some are global, some are very regional. They're very different in terms of who leads them. Sometimes it's the civil society, sometimes it's the consumer, sometimes it's the government. And they all have a very different touch and feel to it. I think, again, this is something that we don't think about enough. We all say we want to transition to the circular economy, but we don't sufficiently think about what's then actually, how does the end state look like, right? And then if we don't know the end state, obviously it's also tricky to sketch the journey to the end state. Now that on circular futures, one of my favorite talking points beyond circular futures is also around the circular transition as such, right? And I think something we also don't think about sufficiently is to make sure that everybody is taken along on this way to a circular economy. And what you see here is a paper I've also done with one of my PhD students that looks into impacts of the circular economy, job impacts of the circular economy for the textiles industry. And what we basically model is we model what does it mean from a job perspective for Europe. So what's the job impact of going fully circular on textiles in Europe? But also what does it mean for countries such as Bangladesh, Tajikistan, Cambodia, Pakistan? And what we found in the paper is that you will have something like 20,000 to 50,000 additional jobs in Europe. Makes intuitive sense because there's all of these like nice vintage shops. They're going to be in your cities, right? It's local employment. And if you fix the jeans, it's also not going to be sent to China to fix the hole, but it's also all going to happen in Europe. So 20 to 50,000 jobs in addition in Europe. But what happens at the same time is that you're going to lose something between 400,000 to 1 million jobs in countries such as Pakistan, Tajikistan, etc., which again makes intuitive sense, right? If you have jeans that are durable a lot more, if everyone just buys half the amount of jeans per year, that's great from an environmental perspective. It's not so great for the jobs in those countries. And obviously you can ask, are these decent jobs? Are these even jobs that you want? Those are big questions. But I think that's also something that we don't talk about often enough. How do you organize this transition to the circular economy as a just transition? Yeah, to close my talk, I brought one of my papers that almost got me kicked out of all of the different jobs I have. Yeah, very controversial paper, which basically was a parody, a reflection on where does the circular economy literature stand and what type of research we actually need in the future in order to get much faster to a circular economy. And I recommend you read this paper, but I brought something that's actually not in the paper, which is my basically thinking around future research directions, future research I'd love to see that I think will make a real impact in terms of transitioning towards the circular economy. And let me just pick out of this long list of 9 items, 3 items that I think are particularly important. I think number 1 is actually number 5, which is I'd love to see a lot more research that goes very, very deep into specific applications, specific sectors. Because, well, I myself, I'm obviously not innocent here. We all love debating, at least the academics among us love debating the definitions of the circular economy. But I think what could be even more helpful than looking into 221 definitions and proposing the 222nd is likely to go very deep into specific applications. Utrecht University, for instance, has just launched a project on circular hospitals, a project that will come up with something like 40 to 50 recommendations for you running a hospital of what exactly to do to generate circular. I think this is the kind of research that really makes a real life impact. Now, the second thing I want to highlight here is number 7, more work on emerging economies. A year ago, colleagues and I just counted what were the countries behind the case studies in the circular economy literature. And we found that 94% of the case studies were Western world case studies. And I think that's a true disaster because actually many of the emerging economies are probably much more circular than the Western world. And I think there's so much we could actually learn from studying these economies. So I think that's also something I think that would really unleash a lot of very, very helpful research. And the last but not least is my point number 9. Keep publishing, keep the scholarly buzz alive. I think there has been a bit of negativity most recently in the circular economy literature. We've now been discussing the concept for 10 years. Some people say 40,000 academic articles, not much movement. Last year, circularity rate worldwide was at 8%. This year, it's likely going to be at 7%. What's happening? I think that's true. There should be more progress. But I think if we now stop pushing this topic and just go to the next buzzword, it's probably also not going to help. So I still think that keeping the scholarly and also the practitioner buzz alive will also help all of us to actually transition towards the circular economy. Thank you so much for the time. And I hope there was some insights of the talk you found helpful.
Thank you very much, Julian, for a very interesting and sometimes provocative talk, which I really enjoyed. We at the moment we don't have time for questions. So we go on to one more talk and then we'll have a break. And after that, we'll have a panel session where there's lots of opportunity to engage for everyone in. So please hold your questions for a second, note them down so you don't forget them. So a brief introduction to our next speaker, John Thwaites. Many of you will know John as the chair of the of MSDI and also chair of ClimateWorks. Of course, she had a huge career before that as a deputy prime minister and held various ministerial posts as well during that career, which is really great because we're trying to bring in this connection between research and policy and industry. And I think, John, you're a living example of doing that. So great to have you here. The reason you're speaking here today is because you're also the chair of the Federal Circular Economy Ministerial Advisory Group. And you've produced an initial interim report a couple of months ago, and you're now working towards the final report at the end of this year. And we're really keen to hear an update on that today. So, John, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Rob, and hopefully someone will be putting up my slides in a minute if I just have to go. There you go. Well, I'll start also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we are, the Boonwurrung people, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And can I really thank Julian for that incredible keynote address to start the Affiliates Day. Rob will tell you this. I have to say the first paper of yours that I found and read was that paper, Bullshit in the Sustainability Transition Literature, because as a non-academic, I thought, my God, what's this going to say? And it was very interesting. And the fact that you even did a typology of scholarly bullshit. So that's something that you might all go away and look at. But I also have actually read the policy framework that you talked about, and it has helped inform me as I lead the Australian government's ministerial advisory group advising that government on the circular economy. And I've spent the last 15 years at Monash, and a lot of what we have sought to do is to provide the best knowledge for government to act on, but also to provide policy input. But I've rarely seen a paper that has so clearly outlined the policy options for government as this paper. And I thought what you did that was really helpful was to divide up the whole circular economy question, which can get a bit confusing and theoretical, into some specific life cycle aspects. So you looked at it from the extraction stage at the beginning, through to the production of the product, through to the use, and then the disposal. So that's what happens to a toaster or whatever. And you provided policy recommendations at each stage. And that's really helpful to policymakers. And so I say to everyone here, as you're providing advice based upon your research, think about the life cycle of the issue that you're dealing with and what different policies might apply at different stages. So I'm not going to join the debate about what circularity is. Suffice to say, we've actually pretty much used the Ellen MacArthur three-pronged approach to the circular economy, which starts with designing out waste and pollution. Second, keeping products in use at their highest value for as long as possible. And finally, regenerating nature and conserving resources. So that's basically what we've used. And as I think everyone in this room knows, what we want to move away from is this, what we call a throwaway economy, take, make and waste, which causes so many of these problems like waste and pollution, like biodiversity loss, like climate change. And if you just look at climate change, around a half of all greenhouse gas emissions come from the way in which we extract resources and then make stuff. So if we're making a whole lot of stuff, we're making a lot more emissions. And if we can make less stuff and be smarter about it, we're going to reduce our emissions. And we do waste so much value. And I think the figure that I have for the last 6 years, the global economy has consumed an additional half a trillion tons of virgin materials. And what really shocks me about that is a third of that extracted material is discarded within a year. Now, Australia is a world beater. I mean, we love our performance at the Olympic Games and in other areas. Well, when it comes to material footprint, we are one of the highest in the world at 31 tonnes per head compared to about 12 average. But we also waste value, and that graph on the side there shows the material productivity. That is how many dollars each country gets for every kilogram of material that is used. And the OECD average is about double Australia's. In Australia, we generate $1.20 US of economic output for every kilogram of material compared to the OECD average of $2.50. So this is an economic issue as well as an environmental one. We can be a lot more productive in the way we use our resources. And in terms of circularity, the way that that's measured is often the circularity index, which is the proportion of non-virgin or recycled material compared to the total material that's used in an economy. And for Australia, that's about 4.6%. And if you compare it to some other countries, Rob Raven from the Netherlands, 27.5%. You know, that's a massive difference. Now, of course, the economies are very different, and Australia, given our huge size and resource-based economy, is not going to be able to reach the Netherlands. But we can do a hell of a lot better than we are at 4%. We should be able to double that and get a whole lot of benefits as well. And that's why the Australian government set up this Circular Economy Ministerial Advisory Group, and the smiling faces there are that group led by the Minister Tanya Plibersek. Over on the second from the left is Ed Husic, who's the Federal Minister for Science and Industry. And that Circular Economy Ministerial Advisory Group has been set up to advise the Australian government on what are the opportunities for Australia in the circular economy, what are the barriers, and to recommend to the Commonwealth what the Commonwealth government can do to advance the circular economy. And I should say, as one thing that I was very keen, and it was part of the terms of reference, is that our advice be evidence-based, because I'm sure that Julian could do another paper on all the advice that comes out that's not evidence-based, that's based upon people's hunches or self-interest. And so we have sought to be evidence-based in what we do. And it's been, for me, a really, really fantastic experience, because the minister has herself engaged absolutely in it, and she's attended every meeting for the whole meeting, like from 10 a.m. till 4 p.m. But even better than that, she's got her cabinet colleagues to come as well. So we had an afternoon with Jim Chalmers, who's the Treasurer. We've had Chris Bowen, the Climate Change Minister, Ed Husic, the Minister for Industry and Science. That allows you to have a direct conversation with the minister. And following that, Ed Husic has followed our recommendations, for example, to include the circular economy as one of the criteria for the National Reconstruction Fund, which he oversees, which is $15 billion of funding that's available for industry and startups and for advancing the Australia-made policies in Australia. So I think that it has been a really positive experience. The circular economy, as well as having an impact at different life cycle stages, it also has an impact on different sectors. And one thing I actually learnt from Professor Kramer from the Netherlands was, if you're going to deal with the circular economy, you have to do it on a sector basis. And I think, Julian, you talked about doing research on a sector basis, because it is quite different. And that's why our group has decided to divide up our work into these sectors, and we had separate meetings and stakeholder meetings on each of the key sectors. So first on design and manufacturing, second on the built environment, on food and agriculture, mining and resources, water, and place-based initiatives. I should say the first 4 of those were the sectors that were advised by the CSIRO as the sectors with the biggest opportunity in Australia for circularity. That is manufacturing, construction, food, agriculture, and mining. Water got put in there largely because the water industry said we are a huge opportunity and hugely important in Australia. And so that was added. And the final thing, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this, is the importance of place-based initiatives. The circular economy will not happen in one way across Australia. It needs to happen in local communities using the regional businesses, regional and local governments. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of every sector, but I thought it'd be worth just touching on one sector because it is so important to Australia. That's the built environment. 40% of the waste that goes to our landfill is construction waste. And the bad news is it's actually increasing. Household waste is going down a bit, commercial waste is going down a bit, construction waste is continuing to increase. And that's a problem for our landfill, but it's also a problem for emissions, because as we build new buildings, we're not only producing emissions in the way we operate the buildings, but there's emissions embodied in the bricks, the cement, the concrete, the other materials that make up the buildings, and of course all the transport associated with them. Now, it's estimated that as our energy system, our electricity system becomes renewable, embodied emissions become even more important. And by 2050, they'll make up around 85% of all the emissions from buildings. And this is something that we can do something about. First, government is an incredibly powerful lever here in the buildings they procure, and Monash, obviously, in the way we build or refurbish our buildings. And so we've advised that the government should use its procurement powers to drive a much more circular approach to buildings. But we've also recommended that our National Construction Code, our building regulations, address embodied carbon as well as operational emissions. And just to give one practical example, it's this Quay Quarter Tower, which is up in Sydney Harbour. And unfortunately, Julian, you're not going to get a chance to go to Sydney, but it's a beautiful location. This building was an old 1970s office building, and the owner, AMP, was needing to have a much better building to get tenants, and the traditional thing would have been to knock it down and build a new building. But instead of that, they refurbished that existing building and used about 60 to 70% of all the existing structure, the core structure. And in doing so, they actually saved $150 million. They saved thousands of tonnes in emissions, and the building was built 12 months earlier than it would otherwise have been. And this is a huge opportunity in the building sector, but the biggest impediment is the point that Julian made about consumers. It's habit. You know, most developers don't think of this. They think, oh, we've got a site, we've got to knock it down and start again. And so I think that's a huge opportunity. Just turning to our interim report, which we released earlier this year, 4 key areas I'd cover. First is that we recommended a Productivity Commission inquiry into circular economy. And the reason for that is if you want to influence Treasury and business in this country, you pretty much need the Productivity Commission. And I'm very pleased that Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, agreed to that. And that Productivity Commission inquiry is now underway, and they're seeking submissions until 1st of November, so we don't have long. But I know some people here are putting in submissions, and it's very important that we do that. Second, we recommended that the Commonwealth use its procurement powers to encourage the circular economy. The Commonwealth purchases $75 billion of goods every year and infrastructure, and a huge impact. And I'm very pleased to say that the Commonwealth has agreed to that now, so that all contracts now over $7 million for infrastructure, construction, now have to show how they're contributing to a circular economy approach. And the third key recommendation we made was that Australia should have a national circular economy framework. And Julian said there are 75 countries. Hopefully we'll be the 76th now after this, because the government has agreed to this recommendation as well. And we'll be releasing a framework in coming months. And so we're very pleased about that. And finally, we recommended that circular economy principles be embedded in key policies. And a good example of that is in climate change. So our national government is now developing 6 climate change net zero plans for each of the 6 key sectors, like energy, agriculture, building, resources, etc. And they've agreed that the circular economy will be part of that. And as a practical example that we're pushing for on our advisory group is that the circular economy should be in Australia's next NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution, to be released next year. So finally, our final report. So we're in the midst of writing that report now, and I don't want to preempt it, but I just want to give a taste of the sort of thing that we're likely to recommend at the end of this month, or at the end of November. First, that point I already made about a clear national framework. We don't have that in Australia now. We've got a bit of a hodgepodge with 7 states, the Commonwealth, different rules, and we need a clear framework. And we need the circular economy to be embedded across key government policies like our NDC. We're going to be recommending legislation, a National Circular Economy Act, and we believe it should be based on the sort of principles in the EU Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation, which is coming into force this year, which does, as Julian said, focus on design, key things like repairability, durability, and there should be legislation for that. We're also recommending that the government support the growth of circular economy markets. And the startups that Julian talked about, they're not going to be able to exist if there's not a market for their product. So you can do all of these great things in your own organisation, but if there's not a market for what you're selling, then you're not likely to be successful. And a classic example is in recycled plastics, for example. There's the technology, the companies are ready to go, but at the moment they say there's not the market, and that requires essentially regulation. A key point for Australia is to harmonise what the states do with the Commonwealth. And at the moment, for example, our CDE schemes, collecting drink bottles, Coke bottles, etc. We've got 7 different schemes in Australia. And all the manufacturers' business hates it, and it costs a lot more. So what we'll be recommending is a harmonisation and some system to achieve that. One thing we haven't really talked about today, but I've really learnt through this process, and I know Rob Raven is really about this, is about the importance of transition brokers at the local level. This is not going to happen by government directive. This will happen by brokers who know about the circular economy, who can bring players together. And we've got a great example here in Victoria with the big build, with all of the big build the Victorian government's been doing, where what they've done, they set up this thing called EcoLogic within the state government's transport department with about 10 to 15 people in it who work with the contractors who are building the roads and with the suppliers of recycled equipment, basically to bring them together as matchmakers. So now if you go along some of the freeways, they're actually recycled plastic is in the noise walls because these transition brokers brought the players together. We will be making some recommendations about empowering consumers. And finally, something I think is relevant for universities is capacity building. And that's something Julian also talked about. What capacities do you need in your startups, in your organisations? And universities have a key role here in their training. And whether it's in traditional education or in professional education, to meet what is a real skills gap if we're going to achieve the circular economy. So thanks, Rob.
Thank you very much, John. And I know we're colleagues, but it's always great to actually hear someone speak about it for 20 minutes and in a structured way like you did today. That was great to get that overview and many, many alignments, I think, with what Julian was talking about as well. So great that you picked up on those as well. So we're going to have some time for a break now. There will be some refreshments out in the atrium. We'll start again at 1:40 for the panel discussion. So you will be asked to come back by that time. Hold your questions, discuss what you want. If that brings up new questions, bring them into the room, and there will be time to get some answers to those. See you in 20 minutes.
It's on. Test. There's a couple of questions online. Do you want me to just spend?
Yeah. Yeah, just give them time to start.
Yeah, just yell out and I'll.
Yes. All right. Welcome back, everyone. We'll continue this session with the panel, and you will recognize two of the panel members. They don't need any introduction, John and Julian. But we have three new panel speakers that I would like to briefly introduce, and also to ask them for their first reflections after the introductions. And then the plan is to go on to you guys, the audience in the room, but also online. Raise any questions or comments you might have, and we'll take it from there. We've got up until 1:40, but John needs to leave a bit earlier because you need to catch a flight around 1:30. So any urgent questions for John, we'll give them first. So very pleased to have 1:40 is fine. Oh, 1:40 is fine? Perfect. Excellent. That's even better. So 2:40. Yeah. Isn't time circular as well? Like, at least in my mind is anyway. So really pleased with this excellent panel. First, we'd like to introduce Cheryl Batagol in the middle. Cheryl, many of you will know her. She's 40 years of experience in waste, water, and environment sectors. Previously, the chair of various organizations, including the EPA in Victoria, Melbourne Water, and also the deputy chair of Sustainability Victoria. And currently, you are the acting chair, or the actual chair of the advisory council of MSDI, and also a Monash alumni, I should say. So great to have you, Cheryl. Second left on your right to Cheryl is Anita Foerster. Anita is an associate professor here at Monash at the Business and Economics faculty and specializes in environmental and climate change law, regulation, and governance. And thank you for joining us, Anita. And finally, and I should say you're the director of Green Lab as well at BizEco, which is an interdisciplinary hub for collaboration on anything related to climate and sustainability in the faculty. Finally, Kendra Wasiluk from the Buildings and Properties Department here at Monash. Very happy to have you as well, actually taking a step out of her long service leave. So thank you for that. Kendra is the program director for net zero and sustainability at Monash University, and we've worked a lot, and many of you will know Kendra as well. She's very active participant in trying to build bridges between operations, buildings and properties, and the research and education activities here at this university. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to say one thing, and I think Mike actually referred to that also in his opening statement, but sort of the overarching question that I would like to put on the table is how we at Monash University, with all our capabilities and capacities, our international networks, our campuses, our research and education, what can we do to accelerate the transition to a circular economy? What does that circular economy future look like? We heard from Julian that's there's no singular answer to that question. And yeah, so what does that tell us for us at Monash University, and how can we help shape policy directions in that space? So first, that's the overarching question. First, I'm going to hand over to Cheryl, perhaps, and you can give us your opening thoughts and reflections of what you've heard so far.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. There's lots of people I know in the audience, lots of people who I've come across in my circular economy journey. Before I get into there's just two outstanding things that I thought was said that have really triggered me to think a bit deeply about them. I want to get into something that's annoyed me for 30 years, and it came out of the economic sector. And it was, we have to cost the externalities. And this just drove me mad, because in the context of a circular economy, what does it mean? It means the environment, the land, the air, the water. And of course, these are all the ultimate public good, the ultimate public goods that we all share and that we all need and we all rely on. And they're not externalities. And really, when we talk about them, when we're consuming products, privately consuming products, we should think about the fact that they're not, those ultimate public good is not an externality. It's intrinsic to that product. So I wanted to start with that because it sort of changed my thinking more than 30 years ago when I started thinking about they shouldn't be an externality. They should be intrinsic to the product, the private good. There were two things that really triggered my thinking today. And I think, Julian, both you and John mentioned around go very deep into the sectors. I think we can't just look at this as one solution for one product. We have to think about what each product means. And if I think about two things, batteries and textiles, car batteries, or even solar panels, we have fantastic things in terms of transition to a new environment, but we haven't thought about or costed in what happens when those goods are no longer useful. Now, car batteries in EVs have really short lives, and we actually don't have a system in Australia. There is one in Europe, but we don't have a system in Australia for recovery. So the environment, regarded as the externality, will be impacted again. Textiles, and Julian, you mentioned textiles, and I belong to a program called Remote Op Shop Project, and I send my recycled clothes to remote communities, but I'm starting to talk to them about, well, that's fine, that's the first round of recycling, but I'm really worried about the end life of these textiles in remote communities. So it goes to the second point that you both picked up, and that was around place-based initiatives. It doesn't matter how small, whether it's a remote community or whether it's, you know, a suburb in Melbourne, or if we think about Australia, or if we think about, you know, our neighbours, we have to think about place-based initiatives. So those two thoughts for me were, you know, very deep into the sector and then think about the place and what works.
Thank you very much for that. I think, Kendra, would you like to go next? I think that's great. Thank you for those words, Cheryl. Kendra?
Yes. Firstly, I was just going to say I concur with what everyone said, so I don't think I need to go into depth about that. But for me, my moment of clarity when I went to the toilet in the break was what really hit me is, and what we're maybe not talking about enough, is just this: we're trying to fit the circular economy into the financial system of the linear economy, and it's just not working. And it made me, in listening to everything John and Julian were saying today, reflect on myself. And if the general public can't get it, I myself am actually quite educated and knowledgeable in the area, and I do a lot of things that I shouldn't be doing. So it is about, one, reflecting how can I do more, and one of them is coming out of long service leave to come and do a panel. But yeah, it is really how can I, in the day-to-day, really change things and also keep myself accountable. And then also looking at the core issue of the financial system, which is big and scary and gnarly. But
Thank you, Kendra. I very much like that point you made around fitting the circular economy in a linear system. I'm sure that will be an issue for discussion. But first over to Anita. Would you like to?
Yeah, sure.
Give
That's
it a
working. Yeah, two really great presentations and lots of food for thought. Thank you. Two big points from me. I think I liked the framing of circular economy as a means to an end. You know, we're in this point in time where we have climate crisis, biodiversity crisis. I think the circular economy kind of framing focuses on the drivers of that crisis, which are our patterns of consumption, our patterns of resource use, etc. And I like the kind of focus on thinking about it's a way to help us live better within planetary boundaries. The other thing I found really useful is the work that Julian was talking about around policy frameworks and understanding where the gaps are in terms of what we're not doing well and what we're not understanding well, because we haven't done the research in that area. And I think this also comes out through CMAG's work that John talked about. I think in Australia, it's kind of going upstream, so moving away from the end of life stuff and beginning to use those tougher policy levers such as regulation, taxation, market mechanisms that help us achieve what is really a very significant shift away from a linear model. So being brave and bold in what we do.
Fantastic. Thank you for those reflections. I'm really keen to open up the floor for any questions or comments. I know you've been very patiently listening and waiting, so I'm sure that there are some. Yep, there's one in the back. So Paris will kindly run around with a microphone. And for those people online, Paris is also checking out any questions that come in through the chat.
Thanks. I have a question for John. Thanks for.
Sorry, can you please just briefly state your name so we know who you are?
Sure. Yeah, it's Jenny Liu from Building and Property Division. I have a question for John. Thanks for the presentation. Very insightful. I'm very glad to hear embodied carbon will be part of the National Construction Code. Okay, cool. Yeah, just very glad to hear embodied carbon will be part of the National Construction Code in future. Change one. So in the current version of National Construction Code 2022 or 2019 or the previous version, the Section J energy efficiency only talks about operational energy. I think it would be a great step if we can put embodied carbon in. So my question or my concern would be National Construction Code set the bare minimum requirement for buildings. In another word, it means it defines the worst building we can build in Australia. So my concern would be it might cause a huge influence in building industry. So is there any research or consultation or more information you can share with us to how we can put embodied carbon in the construction code? Thank you.
So to get in the construction code, essentially the building ministers have to agree following a recommendation of the Australian Building Codes Board. And we have made that recommendation. Whether that happens is going to be up to the political process. And as I was discussing with Julian before, the political process around the world is actually going in the wrong direction on these issues at the moment. I don't know how long it will last, but all anyone wants to talk about is cost of living. And in Europe, there's been a pushback against some of these things. And in Australia, I think it's beginning to come. So all I'm saying is I'm not convinced it's going to be easy. Having said that, the way you get around that is to build community support for it. So energy efficiency and solar panels here are actually pretty well supported. Like no one could bring in a rule now to stop solar panels. Everyone loves solar panels because there are so many of them. That wouldn't have been true 10 years ago. And so I think when we talk about the circular economy, we have to frame it in such a way that people see it gives them a benefit. And that, I don't know whether that in terms of research and academic, as far as that can be a study, and I know there are people from the Climate Change Communication Centre here, that's the sort of thing we have to think about. How are we going to communicate that this will actually be good for people in their households?
Thanks, John. I wonder, Julian, if you want to speak to this point briefly as well, if you've got any good examples from the European context. I think the point of societal support is really important. I know we've got Joe Lindsay, for instance, here, who I collaborated with, and we did some research also on experimenting in households and how that can help understand what the barriers are to live a low waste or a circular life from an everyday perspective. Maybe, Joe, you would like to speak to that later on a bit as well. I don't want to put you on the spot. But first, Julian, what are your reflections to this question?
Yeah, maybe 2 or 3 points. Number one, fully agree with John that what we're currently seeing, at least in Europe and I think also in many other parts of the world, is a bit of a backlash when it comes to sustainability, sustainable development, ESG, to some extent also circular economy, right? So I think my worry here is that the window of opportunity for implementing policies, it's possibly closing. So I love to see the work that John is doing, and I think you can't accelerate that work enough to make sure you're actually landing those great ideas that you've put out there, right? I think that is kind of like idea number one. I think point number two is there is a group of consumers out there in pretty much every country that is very willing to engage with sustainable products, with circular products. I think there is a lot of research ongoing that tries to understand like what are the exact preferences of this group. I said previously, this is probably 10 to 15% of consumers in the European Union. I think the kind of research I'd love to see a lot more is actually research that touches upon what can we do to bring those 85% of consumers that don't agree enough about circularity and sustainability, what can we do to make them switch, right, and become much, much more aware. And I think that is one of the big questions of our time where I just love to do some more research in. And then maybe the last point, also touching upon John's point around we need to frame circular economy as an opportunity. I can only underscore that and very much agree. I think what made circular economy so successful actually in the very first place was these reports that Ellen MacArthur Foundation put out 10 years ago that basically said circular economy is this concept that allows you, and I'll put this in very easy terms now, that allows you to make a lot of money while making the world a better place, right? All of these like analysis Ellen MacArthur Foundation put out there in terms of business growth, economic growth you can realize while realizing also more sustainability. I think this dual framing is what made circular economy so interesting for a lot of businesses around the world, right? And I think this is very much the framing that we should continue to push, and I think can be core and center to make sure that this backlash at some point gets reverted again.
Thank you. Kendra, can I just ask you in response to the question of embodied energy? And I know you have been leading the implementation of the circular economy framework at Monash. What's the role of embodied energy in that? Is that part of the framework or is that not part of the framework? And if so, how is it?
It is part of the framework. So there's 5 pillars in the framework. One of them is buildings, and one of the targets we have is to reduce embodied carbon in buildings by 20%. By 2028, I think. So we do have it in there, and it is 20% is aligned with what is seen as best practice by the Green Building Council at the moment. So yes, we have it in there. Now we just have to do what is a challenge for the building industry is how do we calculate that to make sure we're actually achieving that target.
Thank you. Happy to get another question or comment from the floor. Yeah, there are a few. Roelof, and then in the back.
Thank you. Thanks, Julian and John, for your presentations. Julian, I wonder if we could reflect for a moment on the role of big business. If I think about the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and why I believe she was so successful in what she did early on is because she got McKinsey's involved. And I actually got to meet Andrew Morley last year, just before he retired. And Andrew Morley was a CEO there, ex-McKinsey's for the last 10 years, I think. So Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been very successful through, the work and the influence of McKinsey, certainly. And I agree with you that the early reports have been absolutely fundamental to seeing the shift in interest globally in circular economy. And much so because those early reports gave, in fact, the quantitative numbers as to what was involved and what could be gained through going circular. But we haven't seen that traction. And in fact, if we just reflect on Unilever within the food industry, under Paul Polman's, they were very much focused on circular economy strategies. But now with him gone, you see the influence of just one leader changing, and Unilever sort of formally pulled back on its objectives. So if I look at, what's happening in the big end of town, these very big organizations, there was enthusiasm, but even those that dared to be leaders are sort of pulling back. And my own research, which is on small and medium enterprises, and I've made a comparison between Amsterdam and Melbourne, I can see where the SMEs fit in, which you also were alluding to. Because they can fit into that niche market and service the needs of the 10 to 15%. So I understand that mechanism, but I do have a concern about large companies and this issue of rational economic decision making. And it's really radical for them to move beyond just experimentation and then to commit to products to try to push them into mainstream market that effectively are going to cost more if they want to push a circular economy. So sorry for the lengthy question, but you know where I'm headed. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, thank you so much for the reflection. And I largely agree with your diagnostic. I think these early reports caused a lot of pilots in the large companies out there. And I think I could not name a single instance, though, where any of those pilots actually resulted in a true circular transition, right? I think basically all of the companies have been stuck in, as I said earlier, pilotitis. And as you've said, I think some have actually reverted back, right? So they've even said pilots are not working. Let's abandon it. In Denmark, where I'm academically based, also Lego, for instance, another example of a company saying, well, we tried out to have circular Legos. It's too expensive, so we'll just stick with linear Legos, right? So I think this is very concerning. And I think this, what you described, right, that the large companies, they understand what would be needed, but they're unable to act on it. I think this is not just true for sustainability, but I think this is oftentimes very inherent in large organizations, right? As a German, for instance, like right now we're discussing a lot the automotive car industry that has basically been knowing for 10, 15 years that they're heading the wrong direction, but they've been unable to change course. It's a bit like the Titanic, right? You know where you're heading, and you're still continuing to head for that large iceberg. So I agree with your diagnostic. And the way I look at this is I think it's great that these Ellen MacArthur Foundation reports created so much buzz, that they also created some activity in the large businesses. But as I said also in my talk, I wouldn't bet on the large businesses to lead the way when it comes to circular transition. I would much more bet on those new companies that are basically launched from day one with a circularity mindset, some of which have now started to scale. I would also, to some extent, still bet on government. I think some governments, the Dutch government, for instance, have been quite radical in the policies they've implemented. Let's see also now with the new Dutch leadership, how much of that survives this now. But still, I would still put some bets on government. And I still believe that also good academic research can chart the way towards more circularity, right? But yeah, fully agree with your diagnostic that probably it's not going to be the large incumbent companies out there that will lead the change.
Thanks you, Rudolf and Julian. I would keen to hear Anita speak as well. Maybe Cheryl, you also have some thoughts, given that you worked on the regulatory side.
Quickly on the way through, this is coming from a former regulator, but I'm actually seeing the superannuation organisations and their ESG groups, and they all have now very big ESG groups, putting significant pressure on large companies. And it's probably more important than the regulatory environment that those superannuation organisations do it. And in fact, I think I read in today's Fin around a governance matter that the super companies are putting pressure on a company.
That's a perfect introduction to what I was going to talk about, because, I mean, although I think Julian's point is really important, that it's the startups that'll lead the way, we still have this massive body of incumbent businesses that we need to shift if we're going to do this. So what are the tools that do that best? And to pick up Cheryl's point, firstly, what we have seen in Europe develop more quickly than in Australia, but there certainly seems to be movement in that space, is around really kind of harnessing the power of investors and bringing circular economy considerations into framing of ESG risks and opportunities for business, and then introducing that into corporate sustainability reporting frameworks and sustainable finance taxonomies. So under the EU corporate sustainability reporting framework, companies of a certain size have to report not only on climate change impacts and risks to their business, but also biodiversity impacts and risks to their business and circular economy. So they have to report on resource inflows, resource outflows, waste, and the targets they've set around those measures. And then it's incorporated into the sustainable finance taxonomy in Europe, so that's a kind of definitional exercise of thinking about, how do we classify circular business activities? And they've done that for the construction industry and for some areas of manufacturing, and kind of set out metrics, and businesses then have to report on the percentage of their business that aligns with these criteria so that investors can make decisions on how they allocate funding. So they're measures that I think were certainly mentioned in the CMAG report and would follow on nicely from what we're already doing here in Australia on climate. And there's a model there for how that could work. But more broadly, how do you move incumbent businesses? I think then you really need to think about tougher regulation of product design and manufacture, et cetera, prohibiting or phasing out things that we know are really harmful, and then using tax measures, for example. I'll give a plug to a project we're just starting in BizEco with MSDI around the role of taxation measures in supporting circular economy uptake. And certainly if you look across to Europe, using different kinds of tax measures seems to be really central to supporting all of these other things that we can do on circular economy. So a real mix of measures, but I think boosting the direct regulation, the information type reporting requirements on big business and super, and then looking at tax more broadly would be really important. It's a long answer.
Fantastic. No, that's great. We'll move on to another question in the room. I know there's some questions on the line as well, which we get to in a second.
All right, thank you. I'm Limin Fu. I am from the Monash Business School. I have a question for Julian, and it's very specific related to your analytical framework for circular disruption. I noticed two things on the table. One is the guidance of the search, and the second is knowledge development. I was thinking, so if companies were to guide their own search without policy incentives, how could they do that? And then secondly, this is a related question. If they were to develop their circular knowledge, and where are the possible sources of knowledge, and how do they process this new knowledge and learn this new knowledge, especially given that it's very possible that it's incompatible with their current business practices or their cognitive schema, we would say. So in your experience, have you noticed some successful examples? How do they do that? Thanks.
Yeah, I think thanks a lot for sharing the question. I think guidance of the search is an important element of the circular transition. I also think, though, that in the end of the day, it's the companies and maybe it's the startups that also to some extent need to guide themselves, right? So I think it's good to have a bit of to have a bit of alignment in the ecosystem of where the journey could go. I think it can actually be outright dangerously if there's too much guidance of the search. And basically, for instance, the policymaker says, we know where everything needs to go, and now companies, please just follow us. I've not touched upon this in this talk, but there's a lot of debate right now regarding missions and missions for sustainability, mission-oriented innovation policy in both academic realms, but also the policy realms. I am somewhat critical of this, right? Because I think there's also a big danger that the policymaker overestimates what they know, right? I think there's ample evidence in the past 50, 60, 70 years that policymakers are not always best at figuring out the direction and at picking winners, right? So that may be on your first part of the question in terms of guidance of the search. I think in terms of knowledge development, I think here what remains underexplored is successful collaborations between academic institutions and startups, but also large-scale companies, right? We've been debating this for decades, that in an ideal world, universities are fruitful collaborators of companies. Oftentimes, at least in Europe, we see that these are very much operating in silos, right? So there's silo one, which is the university, and there's silo number two, which is the company. And I think they could learn so much more from each other, which they oftentimes don't do. I think actually the Netherlands probably is one of the best examples of an ecosystem that has been able to build some bridges. I myself, for instance, have done research projects where ING, the bank, was a partner, and basically they gave us very concrete questions of what they were wondering, of how to assess the circular business model. And as a part of our research, we tried to find answers to these questions. But I think overall, there's still so much to do in creating additional bridges between academia and between businesses, and then making sure that the business don't have to do all of the knowledge development, but also knowledge diffusion themselves. So.
Fantastic. Anyone else in the panel who wants to add to this comment? No? Then can I suggest we go to some of the online questions, Paris?
Thanks, Rob. We have a question from Liam Smith, who's the Director of Behaviour Works at MSDI. Liam has asked, if consumers are a key sticking point for a circular economy, why isn't more attention paid to them and their needs, and how to shift behaviour?
Good question. Who feels tempted to go into this?
Yeah, I just give a very short answer. I think it's a fantastic question. I wonder exactly the same, right? So if you look at all of the literature, the 40,000 articles out there on circular economy, I'm stunned that there's just a handful of good articles on consumers in the circular economy. I think it's a major research gap, and I'd love to see more research. So I think question to the point, and I also wonder what the right answer is, why not more people have jumped at it.
Yeah, John. Well, the mic goes that way. Can I just one additional thought on this one? And I was thinking about your the four futures that you showed, the four circular futures. And to me, it appears to me that they're quite different in the role of consumers. Even the language of consumers fits much better with the top left one than, let's say, the bottom right one. So we kind of, with the language around economy and consumers, you're kind of locked into this circular modernism, I think, which you talked about, whereas it sort of excludes maybe other possible futures, the ones that are more on the bottom right, which was, I think, about, low-tech, decentralized solutions. So just a thought out there that the language actually also matters when you talk about consumers. John, over to you. Oh, Cheryl, do you want to go? Okay, John first, then Cheryl.
Well, I agree with Liam, and certainly our advisory group has identified behaviour change as one of the key levers for achieving circularity, along with policy and regulation on the one hand, economic incentives and market creation secondly, and then thirdly, behaviour change and cultural change, systems change. I would hope that this is an area, once again, where researchers can play a very practical role. And I know Jenny Macklin's in the room. This is exactly the work she's been doing up the back. And I'm sure she could speak more about it. But yes, I think you're dead right, Liam. In terms of governments, while they're more interested in behaviour change than they were, I'm not sure that they have it's structurally embedded in their policy-making processes as much as it needs to be to achieve this.
it's a great question, Liam. Somehow we need to link the communities that live or host landfills or wastewater treatment plants in their community with the people who buy the product. We're missing that. It's a vital missing link that hosting a landfill, and I use that term advisedly in your community, is a very unpleasant exercise in daily life. And if you understood what is in there and how you could make you could make a difference, I think behaviour change is a really key point in this. But first we have to link. We have to understand as a community a deep understanding of what the impacts are.
I had one other thing I really meant to raise before. I can see one direct piece of work I think behaviour work should get involved in, and that is solar panels and what happens to them on your house at the end of their life. We've got the highest penetration of solar panels in the world here. There are millions of houses with solar panels, and within the next 5 to 10 years, many of them are going to be at the end of their life. I know, Liam, you did some work on spillovers, which showed that people putting solar panels on actually that could impact on their other behaviours. So I think their attitude and behaviours in relation to what happens to the solar panel at the end of life is a key thing for us to research, and also to influence government to say there has to be a circular pathway, because if all of these panels end up in landfill or in landfill, it's going to be a huge scandal and very bad for the environment.
Can I just add one little quick thing? I totally agree. It's a really important area of research, but we shouldn't kind of do that research or kind of frame it in a way that gives the responsibility to the consumer. Just your yogurt tub example, the consumer doesn't really mind if, probably most of us, I hope anyway, maybe I'm making assumptions, doesn't really mind if this is made out of recycled plastic or not, but perhaps it's not the best example. Maybe some people do. But what I mean is, you're after the function as a consumer or the service. There's a lot that can be done behind the scenes to make that more circular, and that is, pushing the responsibility back onto big business. So we shouldn't just accept the responsibility, all of it, as consumers.
But the consumers will push the responsibility back.
I was a bit more pessimistic at this point, so I was a bit glass half empty when we were talking about focusing on consumer behaviour and how difficult it is to change behaviour. And I had written down, why don't we stop focusing on changing behaviour and just ban things that we don't want? You just can't have it. Regulation, seatbelts, the behaviour change was it became illegal to not wear a seatbelt when you're driving. Talking on your phone when you're driving, it's regulation.
So I think we're starting to talk about a systems perspective where we need changes across all parts of those socio-technical systems that Julian also referred to in his talk. And it's finding about the correct leverage points. Where do you start? What do you prioritize? And what will have knock-on effects? I know there's another question, a few questions now in the room. Do we also have more questions online, Paris? Just checking. Okay, so we'll go to the question to the gentleman over there, and Jenny's got a question, one in the back, and there's another one over there. So try and be a bit brief with your questions so we can give everyone a chance to.
Thanks, Rob. We've talked about policy, we've talked about taxation, but it's behaviour that's got me really interested. My interests are really around the circular economy and the informal sector, because so much of what we do in recycling falls into that space. I'll give you a quick anecdote. My son likes to tour, or he used to like to tour the nature strips of Melbourne, and would come home with television sets. And his point was, every time he brought one back, if we sold this, it'd be 100% profit. I'd say, good son. Fantastic. But it made me a little bit worried as well, because that is a behavioral training. But there's so much of what appears in the informal sector beyond the grasp of government, taxation, corporates, which we don't deal well with, but the informal sector deals with. So, for example, lead-based paint, glyphosate, solar panels, there's heaps of them. So I'm just wondering, Julian, from your perspective, and maybe the others can add, to what extent are we seriously examining the way in which the informal sector processes so much of our recycling burden at the moment, not only in developed countries, but also in developing countries, because I know that's a research interest. Thank you.
Yeah, I love the anecdote. Thanks a lot for sharing. Really appreciate. We're not looking enough into this, right? And I think this holds both for emerging economies as well as the so-called developed world. It's something where obviously the informal sector, it's difficult to research, but I think that's no good excuse. I think much more work on this is needed. So I think your anecdote is the start, but I'd love to see more work specifically on this topic.
Apart from the informal sector, which may be acting legally, there is a criminal element when we get to end of life of some of these materials. And, you know, we have seen that in Australia in tyres, for instance. We've seen it it's been identified overseas in tyres in a much bigger way. But there is, if we leave this to a sector, to be an informal sector or even a recycling sector, we leave it open to a criminal element as well. And then we're really in trouble.
Thank you. Jenny, I think you got the mic.
Yeah, thanks. Jennifer from Behaviour Works at MSDI, and I do lead our circular economy behaviour change research. But as a behaviour change researcher, one of the things that's really interesting is that my research and Lauren's research, and in fact Jo and Rob's research, has actually shown how difficult it is to get the behaviour change without the systems change. And so actually the thing that I'm really interested in is regulation. And I was just really interested, particularly Cheryl, but obviously many of you will actually have insights into this, about this idea, like how do you successfully introduce legislation when it is going to create such a systems change? What experiences could you share about what makes that work? How do you make that work?
Thanks, Jenny. Regulators live between a rock and a hard place. And, you know, no matter which way you like it, regulation, it should be the underpinning, you know, of the pyramid, that, you know, when all things fail, when there's a market failure. But there is a significant market failure in this. And so what I think is really important is that research, and the research that you're doing, that researchers throughout, you know, looking at circular economy, bring evidence to the table. John was very clear in saying that the advisory panel to the minister is bringing evidence to the table to underpin their recommendations. In order for us to change policy, we have to have evidence, particularly if that is going to mean adding cost. And, you know, we're in a cycle at the moment where cost is obviously very high in the minds of policy makers, but it always is if you add cost. And that's, I mean, my view is very clear that the cost of recovery needs to be embedded in the product, even if it's a T-shirt that I buy. You know, I want to see how that T-shirt has a, you know, container deposit system attached to it, so that at the end of its life, when it's Twigs finished recycling it or it's gone into the remote op shop project, there is a value at the end of its life in order for it not to be discarded into the environment. And so what I'd say, Jenny, is that research is incredibly important. We always struggled to get the data. We always struggled to get the behavioural sentiment around why we should regulate, and it is absolutely critical. But, you know, I'm a reformed regulator. I'll always think that regulation underpins our society and is incredibly important.
Well, I agree with that, but it actually all comes down to politics. Whenever you introduce regulation, you get opposed. Like, I was the first to introduce housing, building energy efficiency in Australia. We didn't have any. It was opposed absolutely by the Housing Industry Association. They're still doing it today, 20 years later, and they've managed to get Peter Dutton to say that he won't upgrade the National Construction Code, the federal opposition leader. So we shouldn't kid ourselves. This is about politics, and politics is about two things. One, getting the numbers within your own party and group, and secondly, about bringing society with you. So you've got to have a good, persuasive argument that brings society on this journey.
I mean, there are some really good examples, I think, from, let's say, the energy transition, which has been going on a bit longer than the circular economy transition. And if you look back at some of the countries where that emerged, and particularly in Germany and Denmark, politics was crucial, but it was rooted in social movements, and it was coalitions between social movements, academics that had particular political views, and industry partners. And you had a green coalition, you had a nuclear coalition, and you had a fossil fuel coalition, and all those three coalitions were fighting for favorable frameworks that would benefit their interests. And so, to me, the other thing that we can talk about is how social movements emerge and the dynamics of social movements. I think that's another element on the table. Do you want to speak to this? Maybe in the real mic, not this.
Yeah, I agree with Rob, and maybe one ingredient to add. So there's one piece of research colleagues and I did where we looked into those countries that were actually able to move from the circular economy roadmap to implementing these roadmaps. And sadly, there's a bunch of countries, as you also saw from one of the slides, that have actually just had a roadmap, but didn't really move into implementation. And one of the core differentiators between those two categories of countries was that we also found a lot of what we called circular economy policy entrepreneurs in those countries that actually implemented. So these policy entrepreneurs, those are basically folks such as John that don't just bring evidence to the table, but they're also a bit fanatic. They're also a bit nuts. They're also a bit crazy about bringing the circular economy about, right? So they're, in a sense, to refer back to Rob, they're almost like activists in a ministry, you could say, and they're just pushing like crazy in the policymaking process for circular economy. At some point, they maybe even be willing to sacrifice themselves, their own career, for bringing about this policy. I hope that's not going to be true for John.
It's all meant as a compliment,
yeah,
John.
Yeah, but I think these policy entrepreneurs, right? To go back more on the serious side, I think these are also very, very crucial because they play a core role in also navigating these different coalitions that Rob has mentioned, right? They're navigating through what the social movements say, what the academics say, what the different political parties say. And I think finding those folks and then also empowering those folks is also a core ingredient to actually bringing those circular economy strategies to life and into operationalization.
You have to go, John? Yeah, all right. Thank you very much. After that comment from, I understand you need to leave now. All right, we've got two more questions, at least. There's one in the back and one over there. So we go first.
Yeah, so I suspect the answers to my question won't add much to what's already been said, but I just pick up the point that on costs, and that is that we're already paying the costs of waste. We socialise that cost and we don't privatise the cost. So in other words, we are paying through our taxes and our rates and so on for the cost of waste. We have in Victoria a Circular Economy Act that in theory legislates that we will separate waste. When I looked out the front of my house this morning, it was bin day, and I think maybe 10% of the houses were using their green bins. I don't know what the rest were using their green bins for. But perhaps is a start to calculate the social costs of waste and the implications of that in terms of rates and taxes, because there is no transparency. I think in the waste levy in Victoria, the cost of disposing of waste at tipping points is quite high, and councils complain about that and use that to feed back into your rate charges, and in Victoria increasingly a separate waste charge from your council rates. But I guess it is getting into people's calculations and personal and individual calculations. Perhaps, as Cheryl says, it is too hard to go straight to a full transparency and a full cost recovery on waste, but choosing some key targets where we can start to move towards a full privatisation of the cost of waste to create that behaviour change and greater awareness. Is that perhaps a strategy?
Thank you. That's a great question. I'm just going to hold that for time reasons. I also want to put the second question on the table, and then we can get some final reflections from the panel. And Cheryl, you might want to talk about the externality. I think you mentioned externality. So second question, please.
Hi, everyone. Scott Douglas. Just coming back to Julian's point around circular startups, how do we promote the procurement opportunities across Monash for new startups, like through the forms potentially of competitions where student opportunities or student ideas can be leveraged and partnered with industry collaborators to try and access procurement opportunities? Is that something that could be explored to help try and drive that circular startup space?
Thank you. You want to go first, Cheryl?
I'll go first. Look, I think it does go back to my opening gripe around the externalities of private goods are not counted. And so when we pay for our EV, our new EV, and 5 or 10 years later it has to have a new battery, you're paying for that battery, but the recovery of that battery is not assured. Whereas my view is that in product stewardship or extended product stewardship, the manufacturer of that motor vehicle or perhaps even of that battery must take it back at end of life. Now, there should be recovery. There's very valuable elements, but they have, and it's their responsibility to organise it. So we have to internalise the externalities. The externality shouldn't be the environment taking it all the time. And it shouldn't be the taxation system taking it all the time. It should be that the manufacturer accounts for that in their product. It absolutely can't be any other way.
Yeah, on the second question, public procurement. I mean, public procurement all across the world is very much driven by cost considerations, which functionally first sight obviously makes sense, right? Because you're spending taxpayer money, so you want to look at costs. But I think bringing in circularity here would be very easy, right? And I think also institutions such as Monash can make this decision to say, well, we're not just looking for the cheapest good, but we're actually looking for a good that's maybe produced by a circular startup that is of comparable utility, but maybe it is 10, 20% higher in terms of price. And then suddenly you become a market maker, and you allow a circular startup to have a more sustainable business model and maybe to start scaling, right? So I think that's for sure something I would encourage you to look into, how to amend your procurement rules to become a market maker for these circular companies. I think a second point is I learned earlier today that Monash University is the largest university in terms of student numbers in Australia. So there's a huge amount of talent, and I don't know what Monash overall is doing to encourage this talent to also become active as entrepreneurs, maybe as circular startup entrepreneurs at some point. So I think that's also something for sure to look into. I think there's some great examples in the European Union now of universities really encouraging their students to not just go into big businesses and take jobs in big business, but actually to launch startups. Oxford University, LMU Munich, also Utrecht University have many fantastic schemes that I think could be copy pasted. And yeah, again, I'm not sure what Monash does on this front, but for sure, I think more could probably be done. And I think that could also be then a significant contribution to accelerating the transition towards a more circular economy.
Well, you'll be pleased to know we've got some students sitting there in the back, and we've got some very active students, participants in this space. We've also have a precious plastic movement here at Monash, which I think originated in Delft University, but it's sort of one of those movements that student-led that really is about circularity and putting that into educational places and develop products out of waste. And it's a great initiative. If you have time, I recommend have a look at that place.
There was also
Kendra?
the Monash Generator, which is about commercializing research and supporting startups. I don't know in detail, but I guess for me on the procurement, I was going to raise that. So currently at Monash, it is a value for money procurement. So you can set the weighting of percentages. The challenge is you have to set the non-financial criteria quite high to outweigh the pricing difference. And then in cases where it may come out a more expensive product, but has, you can give more score to SMEs, to people with innovation. It's making sure the final decision maker as well doesn't override that decision. And the university does have, so if you reference the university's risk appetite statement, it talks in there about the university is willing to take investments that might not have a financial return. And then the last one is the students. And I think the students, there's 80,000 of them. It's the student voice can be really impactful about what Monash does operationally for me. So divesting from fossil fuels came from a student movement. And anytime me or my team presents to students, the first question is always, has Monash divested from fossil fuel? So if the students could start asking, what is Monash doing about waste in the circular economy, then that would be great because we can start asking those questions and getting pressure from the student community.
Fantastic. Maybe for time reason, I just want to go to Anita maybe for some final reflections or anything else you would like to respond to these questions.
Yeah, great. Probably just quickly to pick up on Michael's question around internalising costs. So I think if you look broadly at our taxation system in Australia, we tend to put heavier taxes on renewable resources, labour, and we don't tax the use of raw materials, non-renewable resources. Big, huge changes. No one wants to go near it, but that's the truth of the matter. In terms of kind of wrapping up, I think there's a really nice opportunity at the moment where we've got federal government interest in circular economy and a really great platform for policy change that picks up on all the different levers we're talking about. So get involved, make a submission to the Productivity Commission and CMAG and present your research that's relevant as that as those processes roll out, because there's a bit of a momentum there that we should capitalise on.
I'm adding to my CV, policy entrepreneur.
All right, well, I think we'll have to stop here for time reasons.